Welcome back to part 3 of the Chapter 10 lecture. This should be the last segment that we have to do. Barely a week after his inauguration, Adams received word that France had refused to receive the American ambassador Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. At the same time, the French Directory launched an undeclared war against American shipping, capturing nearly 300 merchant ships. Adams also heard that the French were plotting to stir up discontent in the Western territories. Calls for war, this time from the Federalist press, ensued. Remember that the Federalists have been allied with Britain, and the Anti-Federalists have been allied with France for the last couple years before this. Perhaps France, once they see that Adams wins, that kind of stimulates this sudden anti-American sentiment that they're displaying. In the meantime, Adams sent Elbridge Gerry, I'm going to say Jerry, because I think we get gerrymandering from that guy's name, but I might need to Google that. Anyways, Jerry, I'm going to say Jerry, of Massachusetts, and John Marshall of Virginia, to join Pinckney in France. He also asked Congress to increase funding the Navy, and there was the predictable break along sectional lines over that request. Congress did, however, end up authorizing a new Department of the Navy. Meanwhile, Adams' delegates found upon their arrival in Paris that they were expected to pay a bribe to 3 French agents in order to open up negotiations. Adams made a report to Congress about this, and he referred to the French agents as X, Y, and Z to kind of respectfully conceal their identities, and so that's where we get the name the XYZ affair from. The XYZ affair inflamed Americans against the French and caused a popularity bump for Adams, and we get that popular slogan from it, millions for defense but not a cent for tribute. From the American perspective, we are a full-blown nation, we are a sovereign nation, and we should not have to pay a bribe to meet with officials to conduct official state business, right? That's kind of icky, that's kind of dirty, we're a nation, so please respect us. That's kind of our perspective in this. In 1798-99, although there was no formal war declaration, the U.S. engaged in what we call the quasi-war with France. Treaties dating back to the American Revolution were repealed, and the U.S. leveled a trade embargo against France, meaning we're not going to trade with them. The American government also started to support Haitian independence, something that had not happened during the previous administration. Of course, Haiti under French control, or, nominally under French control, they're seeking their independence. When we start to support the people advocating for independence from France, that's our kind of way of, trying to get back at France. Perhaps the Adams administration was not, super philosophically keyed into what the Haitians wanted. It was more just a way to kind of get back at France, if that makes sense. The Marine Corps was created at this time, and merchant ships were armed. Eventually, Talleyrand, he's a French foreign minister, tried to make peace overtures. He tried to indicate, hey, it's time to maybe get this quasi-war over with. And from the French perspective, this was going to be a key move prior to a planned French invasion of England. They end up deciding they want to go and wrap up their drama with us because they got bigger other fish to fry, and that's going to be good for us, right? But we've still got this war hysteria going on. War hysteria led to Congress passing the Alien and Sedition Acts. Naturalization is also thrown in there sometimes, the Alien, Naturalization, and Sedition Acts. These ended up hurting Adams. He did not directly request them, but he did accept them. Got that quote from Coach Mike Leach, right? You either coach it or you allow it to happen. And Adams, even if he did not coach it, he certainly allowed for this to happen. And this is kind of a stain on his record, really. Federalists were increasingly fearful of pro-French sentiment within the Democratic-Republican Party and beyond. These 3 laws, again known together as the Alien, Naturalization, and Sedition Acts, lengthened the time to qualify for citizenship from 5 to 14 years and allowed the government to deport anyone it deemed dangerous. The Sedition Act specifically targeted newspaper editors against false, scandalous, and malicious speech against the government. It was vigorously enforced, and some served jail time because of the Sedition Act. Democratic Republicans were opposed to the acts as a fundamental threat to democracy. Early on, there are calls that, this is unconstitutional, this clearly violates the First Amendment, which it totally does, But again, these amendments and everything, we're still trying to figure it out. It's kind of new at this point in time. And the Federalists, they got away with these laws in Congress, and they're on the books, and so, you know, they're going to be enforced. The Democratic Republicans end up coming out swinging against this. In the fall of 1798, Jefferson drafted resolutions that were then adopted by the Kentucky legislature. These resolutions asserted a state's right to declare federal law void within the state's jurisdiction. From Jefferson's perspective, and really we're talking about the doctrine of nullification here, states came first, right? The states preceded the federal government, the states created the federal government, and so states are the final arbiters, the final deciders of what is and is not constitutional. And if the feds try to do something not constitutional, states get to be the ones to check them, right? And now in the modern day, we decide things differently, right? The Supreme Court decides constitutionality now, but at this point in time, and even through Andrew Jackson's time in office, we see states trying to assert that they've got the power to determine constitutionality. The doctrine of nullification is what this comes to be known as. We're going to see that, come up again. The Virginia legislature adopted similar resolutions that were drafted by James Madison. So you got Madison and Jefferson here, both Kentucky, Virginia resolutions coming out against the Alien and Sedition Acts. Definitely got to know that. Taken together, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions drew a sharp line between these two political factions, the Feds and the anti-Feds, or Democratic Republicans. As war fever began to subside, began to grow weaker, Adams became convinced that Hamilton was trying to stir up trouble for his own political motives. Eventually, the Convention of Morfontaine ended the quasi-war with France and moved to protect U.S. shipping. Adams also pardoned John Fries, who had led a non-violent rebellion against federal war taxes in Pennsylvania in 1799. Another example of a tax rebel getting caught, being pardoned. Last slide. In 1800, the differences between the two candidates were very clear. Issues resurfaced, though, over problems with the lack of anticipation of political parties, right? Our founders did not create the Constitution with political parties and factions in mind, and operating within a party system creates some difficulties that the Constitution did not anticipate and does not address. Under the old rules, Adams, a Federalist, had been saddled with Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, as his vice president. Remember how it's not until the 12th Amendment that, the second place vote getter doesn't get to be VP. So even though they were the top two vote getters, they had difficulty working together. It's difficult to collaborate and try to build a nation if you don't agree on what kind of nation you're trying to build. This is a difficulty that we're going to end up rectifying, but not quite yet. Months before the 1800 election, the two parties, who by this time were even better organized, met in semi-secret caucuses to choose their nominees. Jefferson and Aaron Burr vied for the top spot in the Democratic Republicans. In the end caucus, party leaders pledged to have every elector vote for both Jefferson and Burr. Hopefully this would ensure that the runner-up would be vice president. They try to kind of pool their votes between these two people. The Federalists were also torn between Adams, the incumbent, and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. He was the popular hero of the XYZ affair. Remember, he's one of the 3 people who got sent over to France. Certainly no friend of Adams, though. Hamilton hoped to engineer Pinckney's election as president. Hamilton does not want to see Adams retain the presidency. Because the Constitution does not specify the method for choosing electors, actual voting for them was spread out throughout the year. Remember, here we got the Electoral College. Burr was able to ensure New York's electoral votes for the Jefferson-Burr ticket. The contest remained fierce throughout the fall. Southerners were also concerned by the prospect of a slave rebellion, as news spread of Gabriel Prosser's plan to kill all whites except for Quakers, Methodists, and French people, in his words, near his home in Richmond. Make sure that you know about Gabriel's rebellion. It's in your textbook. Gabriel's plan was discovered, and its leaders were quickly tried and executed, but the fallout persisted during the presidential campaign. Adams didn't like slavery. Pinckney, his running mate, was one of the largest slaveholders in South Carolina, though. Jefferson and Burr both owned slaves. Jefferson had written in opposition to slavery, but he still held them. And then there's, of course, the Sally Hemings thing. Jefferson's legacy related to slavery is incredibly complex. There's actually a wonderful lecture about that on Gilder Lehrman that I'd be happy to recommend if you reach out. I can't quite remember the name of it right now. But there's a wonderful, wonderful speech on there about his duality and the complexity of his character. Jefferson feared that too many slave executions might spark an abolitionist upheaval and cost votes. And again, of course, this is in the aftermath of the Prosser Rebellion. Kind of a complicated thing right there, but again, really fascinating. Look into it, Google it, come and see me if you're interested. Jefferson's religious beliefs also became a campaign issue. He was a deist, and he had compiled his own version of the Bible. He cut out supernatural references, miracles, and stuff like that. Adams tended to agree with Jefferson on religion, but Adams was kind of more discreet, right? He doesn't cut stuff out of a Bible and then go tell people about it. And Adams is also often more seen in established churches. He kind of makes the rounds. Meanwhile, Hamilton viciously attacked Adams in what seems to have been a private document, noting his eccentric tendencies and his, quote, great intrinsic defeats of character, among other things. After everything, including some vigorous campaigning by the candidates, the election was quite close. Adams swept New England and most of the northern states, while Jefferson took most of the South, plus New York and Pennsylvania. Ultimately, though, the 3/5 clause in the Constitution gave southern states an advantage in the Electoral College that tipped the scales in favor of Jefferson. It turned out, though, that Jefferson and Burr had actually received the same number of electoral votes. We got some drama going on here. This throws the election into the House of Representatives. And although the Democratic Republicans had won a majority in the new Congress, it was the old Federalist Congress that would decide the election just based on timing. Finally, Hamilton used his influence to get Jefferson the votes. Hamilton, while he, didn't like Adams, didn't like a bunch of people, he absolutely hated Aaron Burr, right? He thought that he was like an embryo Caesar, I think is that quote. And so he's no fan of Jefferson, but he thinks Jefferson's a much better choice than Burr. And so Jefferson is president, Burr becomes the vice president, and that's where we stand. And this is going to be known really as the Revolution of 1800. It's known as a revolution because power will switch from one political leader and one political party to another, and it's bloodless, right? Adams agrees to leave office. His supporters don't go get up their guns and go try to shoot the Democratic Republicans, go try to assassinate Jefferson or anything. Jefferson takes over peacefully, and in his speech, in his first speech that he gives, it's really beautiful what he says. He says, we are all Democrats, we are all Federalists, we're all Republicans. He tries to come out and say, at the end of the day, we are all Americans. And this is after a very divisive campaign. There's a little campaign commercial that we're going to be watching in class. Just really, really awful stuff they've been saying about each other. Now here he is, after his election, Jefferson, being a little bit more of a central figure and trying to unite the country, despite, these deep disagreements that he had with those of the opposing party. And so the Revolution of 1800 is really noteworthy for that fact. Power transitions peacefully between people, between parties who deeply disagree and deeply dislike each other, but it's still peaceful, right? And even now, here in 2016, in 2008, in 2000, I'm thinking back to these big elections that we've had that have been so divisive. Even in 2000, you didn't see people, roaming the streets with guns because their candidate lost. We didn't see that in 2008. We didn't see that in 2016. We've agreed that this is going to be a nation under the rule of law, and that really was set, I believe, in 1800 with this election. Yeah, that's really all that I've got for you for this week. Thank you so much for listening in. Let me know what questions you have, or if anything was unclear. I'm here to help you. I'm here to answer questions, so reach out to me if you need me. Thank you so much.